and you've chosen to review Martin Murray's new book, published earlier this year, Panic City, which explores crime and the fear industries in contemporary Johannesburg. So can you say something to kick us off, briefly on what the book's about, and secondly, how it relates to your own work and explorations of the urban condition? And I should say, first of all, as well, introduce yourself and your role in LSE Cities.
Yes, thank you, Jo. So my official title is British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow, which basically means I'm on a research contract and coming to the end of that. It's almost 3 years now, which has allowed me to kind of do my own research project. And it began with Johannesburg, actually, which was where my interests in Martin Murray began. I'll show you the book. Here it is, Panic City, a lovely cover. So to introduce the book, I think the first thing to say is that its premise is quite simple. It thinks about a quite well-known trope about Johannesburg, which is its criminality and the sense of it being a place of high crime, which I think most observers of the city would accept. For me, though, was the interesting thing, which is to come back to my own real interests in Johannesburg, is it tries to sort of take us away from a kind of strict sociology of crime, thinking about the levels of crime that you can record and that you can kind of ascribe to the space, and think about what it's like to kind of live in that environment, that atmosphere of criminality, or at least the perception of criminality and the fear that's kind of associated with that. And so for me, that's a kind of an interesting way in, because I want to think more about how cities kind of tell their own stories, or stories are told about cities. And that's really my interest in Panic City, but in Johannesburg more generally as well, is the way in which the city has told its story, at least over the last kind of 20 years, but also historically right back from its kind of foundation in the 19th century. My training is in English literature, so I'm primarily interested in the ways in which we kind of narrate space. And that's what Martin Murray is essentially doing, but through the lens of crime specifically.
Interesting. I mean, I think the way Johannesburg tells its story, or what stories of Johannesburg have been told about it, is fascinating. I remember going out not that long after the end of apartheid in the late 90s with a BBC journalist to record a series of programs on Johannesburg. And I remember buying him, as a sort of thank you and goodbye present, a T-shirt which read, "Congratulations, I've survived Johannesburg." And that T-shirt wasn't available for long. It was whipped out of the shops and off the shelves by a post-apartheid government who didn't want such a negative reflection of the city. But cities endure, and people's imaginations about cities endure. As I read your review, I reflected on Dennis Judge's slightly wry, tongue-in-cheek characterization of urban studies in 2005, where he talked about the love affair between urban scholars and noir. And he gently mocked the gloomy predictions that urbanists have had about the urban future, about Mad Max cities and so on. And when I reflect back on my own work on Johannesburg, which is very historic in the temporal sense of the word, in a book called Uniting a Divided City, which looked at the first 10 years of post-apartheid, that book was reviewed and characterized very much as part of the urban noir category. It was reviewed by Achille Mbembe, who at that point in time was writing about Johannesburg as a joyful, playful city full of culture and vibrancy. And Abdul Malik Simone, who was embarking on his exploration of people as infrastructure. And indeed, in Uniting a Divided City, despite its optimistic title, it was about poverty being enduring and about the legacy of apartheid in the social and built fabric of the city. So with that in mind, I came to your review of Panic City, and I wondered if you thought Martin Murray's oeuvre, number of books on Johannesburg fitted into this urban noir characterization. And if you can say a little bit about your own work and if it too can be characterized as urban noir.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating question. Principally because I think my understanding of noir is perhaps slightly different to the one that you kind of narrated. The pessimism isn't really part of my understanding of what noir really constitutes. If we take it as a literary genre or a cinematic genre, it has a whole different understanding. But I would say in that sense that noir is actually really interesting as a category to think through Johannesburg. I mean, there's a whole range of writers who've used noir, of filmmakers who've used noir. There's a very famous film called Tsotsi, which is a gangster film, which is interested in the kind of dark underbelly of the city, which is a kind of feature of noir cinema.
Interesting, because Tsotsi is also about the city being playful and creative, as well as being about its dark underbelly, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. It's this kind of like the kind of culture that sits beneath the kind of formal layer of what's going on beneath the surface of the city, that kind of everyday life. Is actually a really interesting kind of narration of the city, almost a love story of sorts. And so I think exactly what you're saying is not to kind of separate the playfulness, the kind of jouissance of urban life from its kind of slightly more kind of muted or pessimistic view. And actually, I think that's part of what I'm interested in is how we can hold on to what looks like a pessimistic tale of a space and actually use that as a route forward into a kind of slightly more optimistic mode. I mean, I come from a slightly different perspective. My interest is in sadness and melancholy and quite formally negative affects. But I don't think of them as any way kind of constricting on a space. I think actually they're there to help us understand how a space is coming to being, and therefore there is a potential futural charge to that, something to look forward to going forwards. And so in that sense, there's lots about the noir to be kind of celebrated, actually, I think, in how we understand the space. And Martin Murray definitely thinks about that noir spaces. He thinks about the kind of uncanny in the city and the ways in which that kind of mobilizes a certain view of space. So I think he's definitely interested in noir in lots of different ways, not just as that very kind of strict, gloomy sense of a space.
In your review, you make a valid criticism of the book, in that in looking at Fear City, it very much focuses on middle-class anxieties and the built environment of high perimeter walls, CCTV cameras, and so on. And you make the point, correctly, I think, that he ignores the vast majority of people who don't have the means or the space to isolate themselves in the same sorts of ways. But in Uniting a Divided City, there's a chapter called The People Behind the Walls, where we look at not just gated communities and middle-class enclaves, but we also look at how people create defensible spaces in ways that are not necessarily physical, but are social. And examples would be the ethnically divided former apartheid worker hostels, where isiZulu speakers would not allow others in, and vice versa. Or no-go areas where not even the police were able to go in and where gangs ruled. Does that have any echoes for you? And do you think about the legacy of apartheid spewing a myriad of defensible spaces that are going to take decades to unravel and dismantle?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the narrative, I think, of Johannesburg, which is it's as much a continuation of the past as anything else. And I think that's the point that Murray's book really kind of bears down on, is the ways in which, you know, apartheid legislation has been transformed into a kind of mental state in some ways, a kind of cognitive sense of of kind of isolation and enclosure rather than a physical one. And so, yes, we have all of the material barriers, the walls, the CCTV, the heavily securitized spaces, but actually there's something much more deeply entrenched, which is a kind of social segregation of sorts, this kind of self-segregating kind of desire to kind of separate oneself off from what is a perceived kind of amorphous sense of danger, which is something absolutely seeded in the segregationist policies of apartheid. So yes, it's a very, very long journey that the city is going to have to continue down. And it seems at the moment like it's taking itself into a slightly, in some ways, even more extreme and entrenched position, in the sense that it's both building walls and creating more and more barriers that at some point one would hope would start to recede and we'll be able to tear down. I mean, I'd say that with going back to the very beginning of your question, which was about the things that are left out of Murray's review in this book. I think in his other work, he does look at the city more generally.
Yeah.
But in this space, just looking at the northern suburbs tends to kind of give you a very specific picture of the city. And actually, if you go out to other parts of, especially the inner city, where it doesn't feel in any way quite so kind of separated, actually places like Hillbrow are extremely kind of vibrant, kind of Afropolis kind of atmospheres, where you have all of these people meeting on the streets and all these kind of cultures from across the continent arriving into Johannesburg and creating a whole new city, actually, from the kind of residue of the apartheid space. And that's something exciting and interesting to do as well. And I know that's not Murray's project, particularly in this book, but I think there is that narrative to kind of put down as well in opposition to this slightly more kind of defensive urbanism.
Yeah. And then looking at that sort of the legacies and how the legacies interplay with contemporary dynamics, how does that fit and mesh with more contemporary patterns of urban development that have been, articulated by urban scholars more recently, not just for Johannesburg, but more generally?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. Murray's point is that we can take a broad understanding of the financialization of space, of neoliberal urban development, and that can take us so far in trying to understand the ways in which spatial development has played out over the last 20 years. And he does apply some of that to Johannesburg and thinks about the ways in which that urge to kind of extract money from space has led to some of this kind of securitization, that actually the business of fear and the fear industry has kind of driven some of that kind of splintering in the city. And I think you can see tropes of that splintering, of this kind of slightly isolationist tendency. So we see islands of development versus kind of swathes of underdevelopment. And this is the way, it seems to me at least, that a lot of, especially globalized cities, seem to be developing, trying to kind of attract inward development into very specific locations, whilst also leaving a lot of the rest of the city kind of running behind in some ways. And so Johannesburg is, in some ways, to go back to kind of Murray's language, a kind of extreme version. He talks about the city of extremes, and this is a kind of extreme analog for lots of other slightly less stark examples of spatial development elsewhere, I think.
Really interesting. And to conclude our discussion, I'd like to turn to how you conclude your review, which is by saying that it's difficult to read Panic City and its focus on the fearful atmospherics related to violent crime and security without also thinking about the ways in which COVID-19 is unfolding in the city. So can you say a little more about that and how the emotional sphere is in dialogue with people's experience or engagement with the built environment, not only in Johannesburg, but more generally from your perspective of lockdown?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to not be too confessional, but I think there's, the language in which Murray's talking about anxiety, about panic and fear, this is really the language, it seems, for a lot of people, that they're approaching lockdown and, being in urban spaces at the moment is an anxious kind of experience, walking on the streets. There's this kind of sense of feeling one another's anxiety kind of radiating off them, a sense of wanting to kind of maintain a safe distance, but also wanting to be slightly protective of oneself. And it seems like this is a kind of extreme manifestation of the kind of anxiety that Murray's reading in Johannesburg as part of the everyday sphere. And so I guess that just breeds further anxiety as one thinks about the ways in which, say, Johannesburg has responded to that anxiety by building itself in, especially in the kind of the people that can afford to have kind of built walls, and they've tried to find ways to protect themselves and isolate themselves. And that seems to be a tendency that, you know, we have to try and avoid, I think, as a reaction to COVID-19. But it feels like that's the pressure from the inside, which is a kind of one driven by anxieties over, you know, health rather than criminality. But the anxieties are the same, the impulse is the same to kind of isolate and kind of segregate ourselves off from one another. When actually, you know, I talked to you, I think, a little bit about another book I was reading about immunity, and there's a sense that in which actually collective immunity depends exactly on that kind of collectivity, the sense that we are all in the shared kind of same space, and you can't have a sense of immunity from a kind of disease of this sort without actually understanding its kind of collective terrains. And I think that's the kind of impulse we have to kind of think through in response to COVID-19, rather than Murray's kind of exemplar of what could happen, which is this kind of isolationist kind of attitude.
It's been fascinating talking to you, Ed. Thank you so much, and good luck with the last period of being locked down. I hope we can meet in real life pretty soon.
Me too. Thank you very much, Joe. Your questions are fascinating.